Shavua Tov, at the conclusion of the Shabbat HaGadol, the Great Sabbath, we can reflect on the tradition of having a class on that Sabbath, as we did, to prepare us for Passover. Today we discussed a story which is part of the Haggadah, which, if understood well, can give us great inspiration and insight into how to enhance our own Passover Seder, indeed how to enhance our entire year, and how to strengthen our faith. I refer to the magical story of the Seder in Bnei Brak. What exactly is the Seder in Bnei Brak? Well, it is prefaced by the Haggadah telling us that even a scholar, even the wisest of the wise, who knows every detail inside and out of the Passover story, is obligated on the night of Passover to have a Seder and to tell and recount the story. And the more one does, the more one is praiseworthy. And to bring a proof, we find 5 great sages, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon, and Rabbi Yehoshua, who are having a Seder in Bnei Brak. And not just a Seder to get it done with, but rather they go all night long, so much so that they don't even know that the dawn has come. Their students have to come in and say to them, "Our teachers, the morning Shema time has arrived." So that proves that even great scholars have to tell the Exodus, and these scholars were the greatest there were, and yet they did it with such full gusto all night long. I'd first like to point out that the existence of this story, it's the only story which we have in the Haggadah of people actually celebrating a Seder, other than the one that happened in Egypt during the plague of the firstborn. And that is significant because this is a powerful proof that the miracles of the Exodus indeed are true. How so? Well, first of all, this Seder took place, we will estimate, approximately 1,860 years ago, more or less. The Exodus, it is estimated, was about 3,500 or 400 years ago. So if you do the math, we are most of the way back through our history seeing that the Jews celebrate the Passover Seder, year in and year out. Indeed, it is an unbroken chain. And at the time of these rabbis, it was already so well established that it probably goes back centuries, if not millennia, before them. Maybe all the way back to that initial Seder in Egypt as we were about to be liberated, which is a proof that indeed those events took place. How so? Aside from the fact that it is consistent all the way back to then, it is an unbroken chain which we join every year as we sit down at that Seder table and we take our place in that unbroken chain. But even more so, it is reminiscent of the famous proof given by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in his book, the Kuzari, that the miracles of the Exodus and the giving of the Torah could not have been made up or invented by somebody afterwards. In contrast to other religions, where somebody, some charismatic figure has a prophecy, or at least claims to, and comes back and wins over converts to their belief, or in other cases they perform a miracle in front of a small bunch of people, the miracles that the Israelites experienced, the 10 plagues, the splitting of the sea, the giving of the Torah at Sinai, took place in front of the entire people. That's probably about 2 million people who were eyewitnesses to these events and were enjoined starting that year and onward to have a Passover Seder. Now, if somebody, says the Kuzari, says Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, somebody would have made up such a story, it would have been impossible to have been in those first years, because if they would come along and say, hey, we have to make the Seder, we have to celebrate the Exodus and the 10 plagues and the splitting of the sea, even if it was 50 years later, 100 years later, people would say to them, how come we never heard of this before? If this person, we'll call him Roberto, if Roberto is making it up, people could say to Roberto, how come you're telling us something we never heard before? Such a major thing? This should be our family tradition. So it couldn't have been made up in those first decades and maybe even centuries after the actual Exodus, because there would have been opposition right at the outset. It never would have gone anywhere. But let's say Roberto lived 700 years later, and he comes and he says, when the people say to him, you're telling us that there was an Exodus, there were miracles, we have to make a Seder, and he says to them, yes. And they say, well, how come we never heard of it? And he'll say, because it was a long time ago and people forgot. But I happen to have received a prophecy that such a thing happened, or I found a hidden manuscript that such a thing happened, and this is what we're supposed to be doing. First of all, it would be a hard sell. But second of all, even if we could accept that that might work logically, there is no Roberto in our Jewish history. Nowhere in our history does someone claim that they rediscovered or were re-inspired to re-establish an older tradition. No, indeed, all we find is that the tradition of the Pesach is consistent and unbroken chain back to the events themselves, which therefore the Seder in Bnei Brak is just part of the proof that indeed the miracles of the Exodus took place. Now, let's take a look at the halachic aspect of this. These sages gathered for their Seder, and they went until dawn. Is that a good thing? Is that an insignificant thing? Or were they violating a law? How could one say they're violating a law? Obviously not, otherwise the Haggadah wouldn't be praising them and telling us this story. Well, the question is like this. You see, first of all, there is an obligation to tell the Exodus from Egypt on the evening of Passover, at the time when there is matzah and maror on the table before you. Now, until when is the obligation to tell the Exodus? We would assume connected to the matzah and the maror, just like the Haggadah says. When is the time for the Seder? When is the time for recounting the Exodus from Egypt? When the matzah and maror are there. And I would assume that means when they are to be eaten. Now, the matzah and the maror are allowed to be eaten only until midnight. The Passover offering was only allowed to be eaten until midnight. So the first question is, how could these sages then be telling the Exodus after midnight until dawn? Of what value is it? Secondly, and the Haggadah seems to imply that there is value from the mitzvah of recounting, and not just from the experience of telling stories until dawn. So why so if it's after midnight? And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is one of the active participants in this discussion. He is of the opinion that you may not have the matzah and maror after midnight. It has to end by midnight, and that is the Torah's requirement. The Passover sacrifice must be finished by midnight, and matzah and maror follow that rule. So according to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, after midnight there is absolutely nothing left to be done, it would seem. Second of all, the Maharal of Prague raises another issue, and that is on a holiday, on a festival, we are supposed to rejoice. We're supposed to have simcha. Rejoicing means you don't cause yourself discomfort, and if the person is going to be forcing themselves to stay awake, well, that's discomfort. So is that allowed? And so he answers, first of all, on that one, he says, we see that the joy with which these rabbis felt in telling this story kept sleep far away from their eyes, and therefore there was no discomfort. The opposite, there was great pleasure, and so therefore on that angle you can rest assured. But the Shulchan Aruch, the Jewish law, says that a person should observe the Seder until they're having trouble staying awake, until their eyes begin to become heavy, because after that they would be forcing themselves, causing themselves discomfort, which is not allowed on the holiday. So therefore, for the rest of us who don't have that same level of excitement, we can call it a night a little bit earlier. But still, that doesn't answer the question of, so it's not prohibited, but is there any value to it? To this, the answer is a resounding yes. And I'll give you the explanation why. Because we'll start off with Reb Chaim Soloveitchik of Brisk. He contrasts two commandments, and both of these commandments are connected to this story of the Seder B'nai Brak. One commandment is the commandment on the night of Passover to retell the Exodus from Egypt. The other commandment is obligatory every day for the rest of the year, which is to remember the Exodus from Egypt. Zechirat Yetziat Mitzrayim. We fulfill the remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt in our daily recitation of the Shema, the third paragraph of which mentions at the end, I am the Lord thy God who brought thee forth from the land of Egypt. So with that we fulfill, just by mentioning, the commandment to remember the Exodus from Egypt. And that commandment is mentioned in this story. Laman tizkoret yom tzeitecha me'eretz Mitzrayim kol yemei chayecha. You shall remember the day of your exodus from Egypt all the days of your life. So therefore, every day there is a commandment to remember the exodus from Egypt. We will hopefully go into that phrase a little bit in detail. So that's the regular commandment, the year-round commandment. But on Passover, there's a special commandment, to recount, to tell the Exodus from Egypt. And Reb Chaim Brisker says that the difference between remembering, which is just to mention it, and recounting is that first of all, that has to be done telling someone else, recounting. The Torah phrases it, you shall tell your son or daughter, you should tell your children. So it has to be told to somebody else. And the halacha is that even if a scholar is alone, they know everything, but they're not with anybody, they still have to ask themselves the 4 questions. They still have to tell it to themselves, because there is someone else who is listening. God in heaven is listening. And God in heaven may indeed even answer the questions in the person's heart. So it has to be, first of all, told to someone else. Second of all, the story that has to be told in sequence. First this happened, then that happened. And thirdly, the symbols of the Seder have to be explained. We're eating the matzah, and we quote Rabban Gamliel later in the Seder, the matzah we eat because XYZ, because they didn't have time, they baked it, and so forth and so on. The maror we eat because the Egyptians embittered our lives. And the Passover offering, which we would eat in times of the temple, is because God passed over the houses. So therefore, you have to explain the symbols. Those 3 things are the hallmarks of the night of Pesach. It has to be done in the fashion of telling someone else. The telling has to be following the progression of the story. And thirdly, you have to explain the symbols. Okay, very good. Now, this says to me an experience. And I'll explain why. What is the experience? When somebody has an experience, let's say you go and you take a trip to California and you meet your favorite movie star. So you gotta tell your friends when you get back home. You have to tell them that I met so-and-so. I remember when I was a kid, I was staying with my family in the Sheraton Universal Hotel, and we just got out of the elevator and walking in the lobby, and I heard the public address system, somebody announced, Mr. Sinatra, please come to the front desk. Mr. Sinatra, please come to the front desk. So I just had to tell you that story, and I told you the story as it happened. First I got out of the elevator, then I heard this. And anybody who tells a story is going to do those things, and if they have evidence of the event, let's say I then saw Mr. Sinatra and I snapped a picture of him on my phone, I will then pull out the phone and show you, and look, here he is, there's Frank Sinatra. Of course, I don't think that cell phones with cameras in them were so common when Sinatra was visiting the Sheraton Universal, but you get the idea. When somebody has an experience, they have to tell other people. They tell them every single detail, and then they go into the pictures. And that's basically what we're doing on the night of the Seder, according to Reb Chaim, where we have to tell somebody, we tell them the whole story, every single detail, and we explain the symbols, we show them as it were the pictures. In other words, we've had an experience. Now that is significant because Rabban Gamliel says in the Haggadah, in every generation a person is to see themselves as if they had left Egypt. We have to look at ourselves and say, I left Egypt, not just my ancestors, but me too. We have to get into that feeling of experience. And well, that experience of leaving Egypt, first of all, it didn't take place just until midnight. Until midnight, the Israelites were busy with the Passover offering and the blood on the lintel and the doorposts and being protected from the plague of the firstborn. But after midnight, they were baking the matzahs, they were getting the gifts from their Egyptian neighbors, they were basically packing up and getting ready to go, which they did at dawn. So the actual night itself is more or less what the sages reenacted. Until midnight, they were dealing with the rituals and the matzah and the maror and telling the story of the Exodus from Egypt, but they continued after midnight until dawn. Of course, they didn't eat, because after midnight you're not supposed to eat. You're supposed to finish the afikomen by midnight, which nowadays is around 1:45 a.m. But afterwards they continued, just like the Israelites prepared to leave. They couldn't sleep. Who could sleep? This was the most exciting day in their lives. And those rabbis felt that same sense of excitement. And that is the first lesson of the Seder in Bnei Brak, to create an experience, not to have an intellectual discussion, but to try to feel how the Israelites felt that year. And that excitement should be so great that we should go as long as we can into the night. We finish the matzah, the afikomen, by midnight, but to stay afterwards singing the songs and telling more stories, wonderful. As long as you can get a proper night's sleep and it's not uncomfortable for you. The second element that we discussed was the content of their discussion. What is the content of their discussion? Well, I think that when the students came and said, our rabbis, the dawn has come, the time for the morning recitation of the Shema. Now, if you'll recall, the Shema is the context in which we have the daily commandment, the non-Passover specific commandment of remembering the Exodus. We have a third paragraph of the Shema, which deals with the commandment of tzitzit. And at the end of that, it says, I am the Lord who brought you forth from the land of Egypt. So we fulfill the remembrance, which is a daily commandment throughout the entire year, not just on Pesach. And so there's a discussion among the sages as to whether or not the Shema, that third paragraph, which mentions the Exodus, which remembers the Exodus, should be recited at night or not. Or will it be recited in the times of the Mashiach or not? In other words, will that commandment continue into the future redemption, or will it be superseded? Now, that entire discussion, which we went into in our shiur today in great detail, I'm going to just skip to one important point about it, and that is, it seems that discussion has no place in the Haggadah Shel Pesach. Why? Because the Haggadah Shel Pesach is talking about the Exodus, the mitzvah of recounting the Exodus. But the mitzvah of remembering it, which is a much more simple mitzvah, as Reb Chaim says, that all you have to do is just say it. You say, Anoch ani Hashem Elokechem asher hotzeti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim. I'm the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. Done. Did it for tonight. So that whole discussion is not a Pesach discussion, it's for the entire year. So why is it included in the Haggadah Shel Pesach? And one could ask a few other questions. I'll put them all in here. And one of them is, it seems that it is a mitzvah to remember, to have the remembrance as well. Because it says, Tizkor, you shall remember, Yom Tzeitzcha me'eretz Mitzrayim, the day you left Egypt. So that's a commandment. Now the Rambam counts all of the 613 commandments in the Torah, but he doesn't count this one. Why not? Why does he not count this commandment to remember the Exodus from Egypt, a daily commandment? Furthermore, a question is raised by the great Noda Yehuda, who was the rabbi in Prague in the 18th century. He asks, how come the Rambam, when he mentions the commandment of Shema, says there is one mitzvah which we fulfill when we recite the Shema? In truth, there are two. The first one is what we call Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shamayim, the acceptance of the yoke of heaven. But the second is the remembering of the Exodus from Egypt. Why does the Rambam ignore the second one and just say there's one mitzvah in the Shema? And you know what, on even a more basic level, let's say there is a commandment to remember the Exodus from Egypt. Why is it part of the Shema? Why is it even part of the Shema? I'm not even getting into the discussion of whether it should be done at night or not. Maybe we'll touch on that, but why is it in the Shema in the first place? So the answer could be, and I have this based on something which my high school Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Shlomo Warman, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, wrote, is that why do we recite the Exodus from Egypt? Why should we remember it at all? What is its point? There is a law that when we say the morning prayer, and the evening prayer as well, we have to connect redemption to prayer. What does that mean? Our basic prayer is called the Shmona Esrei, or the silent devotion. Before the silent devotion, both in the morning and in the evening, we recite a blessing which is thanking God for his previous redemption, specifically the Exodus from Egypt. That is partly because the end of the Shema, as we mentioned, remembers the Exodus from Egypt, so we expand on that theme in the following benediction. And we conclude that benediction, blessed art thou, who has redeemed Israel. And then we need to connect that. We're not even allowed to interrupt with the word Amen. We have to connect that redemption straight into our quintessential prayer, the silent devotion. Why so? Well, I think it's because God creates miracles. God runs the world, runs history. And I'm going to pray to God, and I have requests and things that I want God to do. Now, do I really believe that my prayers have a chance of being answered by somebody or some entity that can actually answer them? And the answer is yes. And how do I know? The Exodus from Egypt. By telling the Geulah, by recounting the redemption, we are reaffirming our belief that God indeed hears prayers, as the Israelites cried out from their bondage in Egypt, and God heard their cries and came and sent Moses to rescue them. God hears our prayers. God controls the world. God can do miracles in order to bring about the salvation and answer the prayers of his people. So we know that we're talking to a God who has, as it were, the resume. And therefore our prayer will be much more heartfelt and much more filled with faith, because we know that we are speaking to a God who can do it. And that's why it's important to connect it. So Rabbi Warman suggests that indeed the remembering of the Exodus from Egypt is not a separate commandment, but it is also fulfilling the main essence of the daily recitation of the Shema, which is acceptance of the yoke of heaven. Kabbalat ol malchut shemayim. Accepting the yoke of heaven means accepting that God is the one who can perform all of these miracles. And so therefore it's not a special mitzvah, a separate mitzvah. It's part of Shema. He doesn't need to mention it. Now, all of this is wonderful, but what does it have to do with Pesach? And to this, the answer is, these rabbis had an experience, as Reb Chaim said. They were so inspired. And their students came and they said, it's time for the morning Shema, which already lit a button. Shema, oh, we have in the Shema the daily commandment. How can we take this excitement, this inspiration, this warmth, this glow, this faith, and bring it into our everyday lives and keep it alive with us? And the answer is the Shema, the remembering of the Exodus from Egypt. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, based on with Ben Zoma's interpretation, that it's even at nighttime. Nighttime is the time, perhaps when things are dark, when things are uncertain. Night is considered symbolic of exile. So even during times of exile, even then, to keep that flame of faith alive, to realize that even then God can create salvation. And when you look at the night of the Exodus from Egypt, so the Jews hadn't left at midnight. They were still very much in Egypt. But they knew that come dawn they would be out. And therefore, our faith, even in the darkness of night, is once God makes the promise, his will be done. And we know that the redemption will come. So it is a tremendous expression of faith. And the rabbis therefore connected that and put that into the Haggadah to tell us that what we are experiencing at the Seder Pesach now is very important. We must take it and hold it and bring it with us throughout the rest of the year, in the daytimes when things are going beautifully, and even in the night times when the world is uncertain. And that will lahavidi mot HaMashiach, that will bring us to the Messianic era, to the ultimate redemption. Shavua Tov and a Chag Kasher V'Sameach.